Hello, everyone. So what I wanted to do with this presentation is, well, first of all, share the findings from my PhD research that I've been working on for the past few years. But most importantly is give a voice to mothers and adults and girls, and try to look at the situation of HPV vaccine confidence in France from their perspective and from their own beliefs and views around this issue. So we already talked about the issue of HPV vaccination acceptance in France, but also in Europe more generally, and actually more globally as well. It's one very highly controversial vaccine for many, and we did a few years ago a systematic review to try to look at what the key challenges are to confidence in vaccination, and why people are increasingly or at least are hesitant in many countries. And what we found in Europe, and that includes France, is that some of the key concerns are related to information, misinformation, but sometimes too much information and conflicting information. And as no surprises here, concerns about vaccine safety, questioning of the effectiveness of the vaccine and the importance of the vaccine. So nothing really surprising. But what I wanted to do with my PhD work was try to understand this from a more sort of personal perspective and understand really how adolescents and mothers make decisions about vaccination. So I did qualitative research, qualitative interviews and focus group between 2018 and 2019. And I based the research in Paris, in various arrondissements, so various regions of Paris. And I've included adults and girls between the age of 15 and 16 to capture girls that had already passed the age of receiving the vaccine, but were still in the catch-up phase, and their own mothers. So in total, I did 24 in-depth interviews with adults and girls and 21 interviews with their own mothers, and 2 focus groups as well with adolescents. So the findings I'll present here are summarized across 3 key themes. One of them is maturity. So how does maturity play a part in whether or not girls are included in decision making? The second one is risk and benefit perceptions. And then there's the issue of trust. So why was I interested in maturity? So we know that mothers are always, and in most cases, the prime decision makers in household, especially when it comes to health. They're the key people making decisions about health, vaccination, and also sometimes in some cases HPV vaccination. We also know that very often children will imitate the behaviors and the beliefs of their mothers. So they will take the same beliefs and values that their mothers have, which can be an interesting point if we're looking at vaccine hesitant mothers. Do they transmit their own hesitancy to their daughters in terms of HPV vaccination? Adolescence is also an interesting period, and HPV vaccination is specifically given at an age that really corresponds to key changes in life, whether it's social life or school transitions. And it's a time when adolescents are at the same time trying to seek greater independence from parents, and also at the same time getting closer experiences and relations with their peers and their friends. So how does this impact the information that they received and who they listen to in terms of health? In France, parental consent is required for vaccination. So the question is not about whether adolescents could make the decision to get vaccinated themselves, or at least not yet. It is possible in certain countries, like in the UK. But even the question of whether we can improve and increase adolescent engagement in decision making through discussions, through informed discussions and engagement, could potentially be interesting and an interesting way of boosting vaccine uptake. And then that leads me to the concept of maturity. And whether or not adolescents actually have the capacity to engage in decision making. And that's what we've seen in many research, is influenced by their levels of maturity. Maturity is not a binary concept, so it's not whether or not you're not mature or you're not mature. It's a continuum. So you progress through maturity, and it could be that you could be very mature for certain things like intellectual maturity, but less mature for in terms of emotional maturity. So you can progress at different speeds. And it has been defined as well in relation to responsibility, temperance, and perspective, which are concepts that I've applied in my PhD research. So what I found in the interviews that I did with mothers and adolescent girls is that, first of all, there was an agreement that that maturity itself influences whether or not adolescent girls are involved in decision making. So mothers and adolescent girls spontaneously referred to maturity as a key element. What I also found is that girls did progress at different speeds, so through maturity. So there were some girls that were expressing childlike traits. So for example, they were very impulsive, making very rash and emotional responses in their interviews and decisions. But then others actually had a more rational, reflective decision-making style. So they were already processing ideas and information and understanding of what vaccination represents. So you really had that continuum of maturity. And even through the interviews, there's a quote here about girls realizing that they're changing, that they're becoming more mature. So this one girl was talking about how her mentality has changed and she's asking more questions, she's becoming more involved. However, that being said, most girls had still a very passive role when it came to HPV vaccination decision making. So most of the time they would follow their parents' decisions, and they were talking about HPV vaccination as any type of health decisions that still remains under parental decision making processes. But even though they saw their parents as key decision makers, they expressed a very strong desire for more information. So when they heard about HPV vaccination, many of them didn't know about HPV vaccination. When they heard about it, they were really interested and they really wanted to be more engaged. But they really talked about a wall that was put by either their mothers or their doctors. So very often they would talk about their doctors not even addressing them when they recommended the vaccine. So they were only talking to their mothers, but not including them in the decision. And when we talk about maturity, we often talk about emotions and emotional reactions. And it's true that girls did have sometimes in the interviews described some volatility in decision making. So they switched, decisions and made their mind sort of as we talked during the interviews. But actually, mothers were a lot more emotional when it came to decisions about HPV, and they were the ones sharing really strong fears and concerns. So it's not necessarily linked to maturity, and it's more about how we make decisions about vaccination. So the second point is risk-benefit perceptions. And when we talk about confidence in vaccination, we very, very often actually talk about whether or not people perceive risks about vaccination and whether they see that there are any benefits. So these are some of the two key points, but we have to understand that this is influenced by a range of factors, as shown here in Cornelia Betch's framework of vaccine decision making, that include beliefs and experiences. It includes the context in which we evolved it. It includes trust. So it's not really as simple as perceiving a vaccine as safe or perceiving it as important. But what's interesting is that all these models that have been created are mostly focusing on adults. So they're mostly looking at how adults make decisions based on risk-benefit perceptions, but very little has been done on adolescents, although they perceive risks completely differently than adults do. So research has found that they tend to overestimate risks. It could be because of peer influences, emotional reactions, but at the same time, they also are higher risk takers. And that could be because they tend to feel less vulnerable as individuals. So they understand and they overestimate the risks in general, but they feel stronger than others in general. And when they make decisions, they tend to place more weight on the benefits of their actions rather than the risks. So going back to what I found in the interviews, first of all, is that there's really, especially among adolescents, there's a sense of individuality in terms of benefits and risks. So adolescents really talked about their perceptions, but also the actual risks as dependent on individuals and differing from one individual to another. So for example, they talked about everyone having a different risk of contracting the disease. It depends on your sexual behavior, for example, sometimes your religion, your cultural values. In terms of actions, it also depends on the body might react differently. So some bodies might react differently to viruses and become more sick. Others might react more strongly to vaccines and have side effects. But what was interesting, they also talked about the values and how everyone has a different way of assessing what matters. A vaccine side effect could matter a lot more to one individual than to another. And that was quite an interesting point. In terms of vaccine benefits and vaccine safety, there were major differences between what mothers and what adolescents talked about. And adolescent girls were a lot more positive about vaccines and this really crazy invention that makes it possible to prevent cancer. They were really enthusiastic, which I didn't really find in mothers. And even I had a few mothers that talked about their own personal experience with the disease, so who had experienced either precancerous lesions or cancer itself. And even them didn't talk about the vaccine as positively as adolescent girls did. On the other hand, when you look at vaccine safety, there was almost a normalized view that vaccines are unsafe among mothers. So it was almost like, well, you know what? We know that vaccines are not safe. So it's not about whether or not we have to define whether they're safe. It's about whether my own daughter will get a possible side effect. And that every time they talked about side effects, they talked about controversial side effects, about the big rumors, multiple sclerosis, all of the rumors you see circulating online. Girls, on the other hand, had trouble understanding even the question. And when we talked about vaccine safety and risks, they kept on coming back to, well, you know, the risk of they couldn't inject it wrong, maybe, or maybe the needle wasn't clean enough. So they didn't really think about these sort of controversial and rumors of side effects. The last point is on trust. And we've already seen for some time that trust is a key influencer of confidence in vaccination and how we make decisions. And that relates to trust in various things. So it's trust in the product itself, the vaccine, trust in the providers, so health professionals, in policymakers like the government, but also scientists, and also trust in information. So the information in terms of the content, but also who produces and shares that information. So whether it's online, whether it's in the media, whether it's at school. And traditionally, parents have placed their trust in proximal sources like doctors, as we've seen in Dr. Verger's presentation. But there's been an increasing questioning of the trustworthiness of scientific experts, which means that now individuals are turning to alternative sources like the media, like the internet, to obtain information, which potentially exposes them to misinformation. So what I found in terms of these four key things in trust, in terms of the vaccine first, is that the vaccine was highly controversial among mothers. Not as much among adolescents, but among mothers, there was a key, really, belief that there's strong public criticism and the vaccine should not be trusted. It was often compared to other vaccines like childhood vaccines. Trust in providers, I won't go as much because Dr. Verger already shared some of the results from my PhD research. But what I found really key was that while mothers expressed strong trust in doctors, girls' trust in their mothers was stronger than this. And for them, even if their doctors would say you should get vaccinated, if their mothers had said no, they would follow their mother's advice rather than their doctor's advice. In terms of health authorities, it wasn't discussed as much, but girls had, as with doctors, really strong trust in health authorities. And mothers kept on referring to the mismanagement of previous events, like we've heard in previous talks, in terms of blood contamination, in terms of hepatitis B. They kept on referring to these as a proof that health authorities can't always be trusted. And finally, trust in in information was interesting because both mothers and girls acknowledged that they'd like to make decisions by themselves, and they like to think of themselves as making the decisions alone, but they also acknowledge the influence of others around them and the information that they received. And an interesting point was that girls talked a lot about mistrusting any type of information. So it's not only about the internet and social media, but it's the belief that any information can be manipulated, can be fake news, should be mistrusted in the end. And that could be an effect of, young people growing up in this world constantly surrounded by discussions around whether or not information can be trusted. So in conclusion, in terms of the three key themes that I looked at, most adults and girls are currently excluded from HPV vaccination decision making, but from the research, it does look that they could certainly have the maturity to make informed decisions. So we need to think of better ways of engaging them in their own healthcare, and this could be a good opportunity to start having these discussions, whether it's with parents, whether it's with doctors. Mothers and girls have very different ways of looking at risk and benefit perceptions. So this should be taken into account when developing communication materials. But also we have a risk of mothers transmitting their concerns and their hesitancy to girls who are still rather positive about vaccination. So we need to think of ways to mitigate that effect. And finally, in terms of trust, a lot of the issues that are coming from in terms of vaccine confidence, HPV vaccine confidence in friends, are linked to broader trust issues, whether it's in the health authorities or in vaccines in general. And that will take time to address, and it will require really long-term effort and strategical thinking to try to address these. Maybe one first step is looking at, benefiting from mothers' strong trust in doctors, as Dr. Verger was talking about. So that's it for me. These are the three publications that I'll share my findings in more details. And thank you.